it's been one of those things that, there's been a lot of hair on fire coverage about test scores, but there are no good test scores. If there are 30 to 40 or 50% of kids missing at least 10% of days in the school, that's just not possible, right? And so through that, I did a lot of coverage about how this is what our hair really should be on fire, about chronic absenteeism. And so that included stories about how it's really bad with the youngest kids, which is especially concerning because in those years they're building kind of the foundations of their knowledge base that they will go on to use for the rest of their lives. And I did stories about how, like with most things in education, chronic absenteeism isn't distributed equally. Students who have the least, the communities that have the least, who are often the most poor, frankly, are the ones who are most affected by chronic absenteeism.
Welcome to the Superintendent's Hangout, where we discuss topics in education, charter schools, life in general, and not necessarily in that order. I'm your host, Dr. Sharetta. Come on in and hang out. In this episode, I was privileged to sit down with Jakob McWinney. Jakob is the education reporter for The Voice of San Diego, whose mission is, quote, investigative journalism for a better San Diego. Voice of San Diego was founded in 2005 and at the time was the first digital nonprofit news organization in the country to serve a local community. Its founders felt that the region desperately needed more reporting, analysis, and journalistic competition. Jakob talks about his circuitous route to becoming a journalist, qualities that he thinks are vital and critical for a journalist to have in order to fill the commitment of the profession and make the world a better place. Jakob and I also talk about and touched on some of the topics that he's reported on, such as chronic absenteeism, homelessness, the impact of COVID on academic achievement, and much, much more. I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did sitting down for a conversation with Jakob McWinney. Welcome, Jakob. Thank you very much for coming and joining us this morning for a little bit.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me, David.
I was wondering if we could start with your origin story. It's important to understand history and where we come from and a little bit about who we are before we talk about the present.
Sure. Yeah. I have a little bit of a circuitous origin story. Before the pandemic, I'd never imagined that I would be doing journalism. I spent about a decade after high school just kind of occasionally attending community college and playing music. That was kind of my big passion for many years. And then the pandemic hit, and I lost both my part-time jobs over one weekend and really upended everything. And I sat around for a while just trying to figure out what's next. I mean, in those earliest days, everything felt very temporary, like we'd be back after a brief intermission kind of vibe. But very quickly, it became clear that this was an opportunity to kind of refocus and find something else that felt more sustainable and felt more, intellectually and emotionally rewarding than music had felt for a while. And so I went back to school. Went back to City College and kind of bounced around in a couple different classes, just trying to knock off prerequisites to eventually transfer and get a bachelor's degree that I had never gotten yet. And ended up taking a journalism class as a prerequisite and just kind of everything clicked. I'd always loved writing. That was what I was, really interested when I went to community college originally. Fiction, poetry, all that kind of stuff. Just love to tell a story. And this kind of felt like a way to tell a story that had real world impact, an immediate real world impact. And, from there, things happened very quickly. Got an internship at Voice of San Diego. And shortly after the internship ended, they hired me full-time to report on education. So it's been quite a journey. My first story published at City College's news site, City Times, in August of 2020. And so it's quite crazy to be sitting here now talking about my journalism origin story because it feels like yesterday that the story really kicked off.
Had you done writing in high school, apart from your academic assignments, had you been? You went to Helix High School,
Went to Helix.
charter school graduate. Did they have a newspaper there, or how did that look? Did you get involved in journalism, or?
No, I never did. I did a lot of fiction writing. Like I said, that was really kind of my passion, and I wrote music. I was a songwriter and lyricist, and I feel like it's interesting how many of those skills translate into journalism. I mean, fiction is fairly obvious. You tell a story,
Right.
you find ways to make it compelling and make it interesting to readers. But when it comes to music, I also feel that there's a lot of similarities. Trying to find ways to make language musical, to find ways to ease people through stories that can sometimes be very dense or filled with jargon. The education world is replete with jargon. Or maybe, bogged down with a lot of statistics that people have to understand. When you're dealing with stories like that, it's really important to find those things that guide readers through and make it, again, compelling and make it interesting and allow them to feel like they're reading something that's, moving and vibrant.
So we could go a number of different directions from that. I wanted, before we get into the actual writing about education, which is, as you say, kind of a unique niche, talk to us about the mission and vision of Voice of San Diego. Well, I'll let you explain. We had a pre-recording conversation about this, and it intrigued me.
Yeah. So, I feel very, very lucky to work at Voice. The world of news is every couple of years it seems like there's this new free fall that happens. But I feel lucky because Voice is a super interesting and I feel thoughtful organization in the way it approaches news. So Voice, for those who don't know, is a nonprofit investigative news outlet. It was founded about almost 20 years ago. And its goal, its mission statement is investigative journalism for a better San Diego. And that's kind of what we base all of our coverage on. Investigative journalism is ultimately a couple steps beyond rewriting a press release, which is, kind of what I think a lot of news organizations end up doing. We really are looking for enterprise stories, and we really are looking for stories that allow us to tell a larger story.
What is an enterprise story?
Enterprise story is one that you go out and find.
Fine.
Yeah. We are trying to reveal and to educate, both in equal measure, ideally. And so we approach our stories from that perspective, really trying to do our best to not hold back, not back down, but to approach stories with compassion. And our team is really, really, really talented and really thoughtful in the way they do things. And we work hard to ensure that our work is not only relevant, but also as revealing as possible. Because news, in its sort of constricting, shrinking reality, now has more to cover. Each journalist is now responsible for more, and we see that with the sale of the UT. And our one of our former editors just freelanced a piece for us about what's been going on at the UT, and it's a kind of terrifying reality. It was recently bought by a hedge fund that has
a sordid past.
Has a long track record in just kind of slashing and burning at news organizations and reducing them to kind of a shell of themselves. And some of that has already happened. But in that new paradigm, especially in San Diego, it's more important than ever to have news organizations that really, kind of give a shit and really work hard to reveal and get people information that they wouldn't otherwise have.
So how did you get into writing about education primarily?
Yeah, it's funny in the same way that I never really imagined myself to be a journalist before the opportunity presented itself. I hadn't really imagined myself as an education reporter. When my internship was finishing up, I had a really great experience. I loved the people that I'd worked with, and there were a couple open jobs at Voice, and I applied for both, and ultimately they hired me to report on education, and it's been a big learning curve. It's really been something that you start to realize very quickly just how vital, really thoughtful and in-depth education reporting is. I mean, this is how we prepare kids. This is how we prepare our next generation. And so being able to hold people accountable when they're not doing, the best job they can be, being able to shine a light on those who are working hard, it's really, really vital. And so while I didn't necessarily imagine myself to report on education, I so quickly realized just the importance of it. And it's been an incredibly exciting, experience. There are no shortage of stories in the education world.
How do you walk that line? Maybe it's not really a line. I see it in my head, though, between being true to the tagline of investigative journalism. I think when people hear investigative, they automatically default to negative, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the IRS doesn't come to investigate because they want to highlight the fact that you've been a really good taxpayer, right?
Yeah.
So I think in the public mind, there's that. Mm-hmm. And then you're writing about a sector that historically, although I think COVID put some dents in it, but historically when people think about educators, they think hardworking, committed to the future generation, all those things you said. Mm-hmm. Probably not the ones that you want to be banging on really hard with investigations. You also talked about shining a positive light on things. Mm-hmm. So talk to me about that whole dynamic and how you see it. Because eventually, if you keep banging on people, they'll just stop answering your calls.
And that's very true. And it's a tough line to walk, right? I mean, I often feel like there are plenty of journalists who are willing to write, the heartwarming stories. But there are fewer journalists who are, like you said, willing to take a harder line with people who historically have had so much goodwill for good reason, But ultimately, I do feel like, inundating a reader in only negative content doesn't help your content, your news, your articles seep in anymore. You need both examples of bad behavior and examples of good behavior. Both of those things are super important when it comes to creating the kind of narratives and writing the kind of news that people will want to keep returning to. It's all bad news all the time doesn't make somebody want to read more. Although bad news is oftentimes, in my perspective, what is a little more important. Again, there's no shortage of TV news stations or other news gatherers that are willing to go and show kids getting free lunch boxes or I don't know what it is. So finding that balance, it's tough, but I think ultimately you need to be able to find something that cuts against what you've already been reporting. So for example, I've done a lot of reporting in recent months about chronic absenteeism.
Yeah, I've followed those. You've done a really good job.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's been one of those things that there's been a lot of hair on fire coverage about test scores, but chronic absenteeism really is upstream of all of that. There are no good test scores if kids are missing 30, 40, 50% of days in the school, or if there are 30 to 40 or 50% of kids missing at least 10% of days in the school. That's just not possible, right? And so through that, I did a lot of coverage about how this is what our hair really should be on fire about chronic absenteeism, and so that included stories about how it's really bad with the youngest kids, which is especially concerning because in those years they're building kind of the foundations of their knowledge base that they will go on to use for the rest of their lives. And I did stories about how, like with most things in education, chronic absenteeism isn't distributed equally, right? The students who have the least, the communities that have the least, who are the most poor, frankly, are the ones who are most affected by chronic absenteeism. And these are all stories that don't necessarily make you want to, skip down the block. But I ended up finding and connecting with educators at Horton Elementary over in Southeast San Diego and writing a story about all of the myriad ways that they are trying to push back against chronic absenteeism. And so that includes all of these events in school to make kids excited to come. That includes a robust program of reaching out to parents and communicating with them. That includes educating them about the effects of chronic absenteeism and what chronic absenteeism really means. And they've had some success. I mean, it's slow success. It's their issue with chronic absenteeism was a really significant one. And so you only make progress by chipping away at it. And so that for me was a positive story that offered, a way forward through one of these really negative stories that I've been reporting for a while.
It strikes me as ironic and, I guess sadly ironic, and it applies here at Albert Einstein Academies too, but the solutions they're simple conceptually, but they're really complicated and difficult to implement.
Absolutely.
I mean, at the end of the day, you're looking at increasing connection with families. Mm-hmm. And I guess the sad part is that we've been operating under this assumption, as long as the kids were showing up at school, schools are getting funded and there's at least a kid there to take a test. Mm-hmm. But we've been kind of operating under the assumption, or never even really thought about whether those families are really authentically connected to their schools. Yeah. So I think now that we've gone through the pandemic and then you're seeing coming out of it, wow, it's like the tide's gone out and you see who's wearing what bathing suit and what, and you're like, okay, so these are families that needed a lot of support prior. They were getting their kids to school, but maybe that connection wasn't there. Now afterwards, they're just dealing with trying to survive. Yeah. I don't think there's anyone who wakes up and says, I want to screw the school system over and just not send my kids to school today.
Or screw my kids' future over.
They're not doing that, right?
Absolutely not.
The dynamics are complicated, and I think the heartening piece is that we're all trying to find ways to engage with families and kids on a really case-by-case basis. Mm-hmm. And I hope that it continues even after chronic absenteeism is reversed.
I agree with pretty much everything you've said, right? When it comes to education, so many of the right solutions are the ones that feel like common sense, but common sense is often super expensive. Yeah. Employing family services, folks to go out and meet with parents, to go out and talk to families, that's not cheap. And as you said, every student who's chronically absent, every student who's anything, every student has an incredibly different story. Yeah. They're all, they all don't come to school for different reasons. They all come to school for different reasons. But one thing that is true is that if they don't feel connected to the school, if they don't feel like there's somebody there who's bummed when they're not there, they're less likely to come. That was one of the interesting things that I saw when I spoke to Danielle Garinani, the principal at Horton, and some of her staff. They went so far as to have students write notes to their classmates. So when a kid missed a day at school, they would come back the next day and there would be a note from one of their classmates saying, "Hey, I missed you. Like, I'm happy you're back today." I mean, it's those kinds of small things that feel small, or maybe it may look small, but aren't small at all. And as you said, COVID had, like it did with every aspect, every facet of education, COVID had this super outsized effect. It basically tripled chronic absenteeism everywhere. Yeah. And that is really bad. That's really not good. And like I was talking about earlier, the tripling doesn't mean that every school ends up in the same place. In places like La Jolla, maybe it tripled and went from 3 or 4% to 12%. In places like Rodriguez Elementary over in Logan Heights, it tripled from 24% to 76%.
Yeah.
76% of kids at that school were chronically absent.
Yeah.
And that's, these sorts of common sense solutions, they work over time, but it's not easy.
No.
As you said, it's not easy, it's not cheap, and it takes a real deep commitment from educators, from parents, who both to learn, but also to implement those things every day. And so ultimately, I think that reversing chronic absenteeism is something that could happen conceivably. I mean, even before the pandemic, there were people who were super freaked out about this. The county Office of Education had created essentially a task force, a network of schools called Improving Chronic Absenteeism Network, because already before the pandemic, there were folks who were noticing these disparities, noticing these high levels of, comparatively high levels of chronic absenteeism, and saying we have to take action on this. And now the problem is only just frighteningly more acute, and it's going to take a lot of time. And I don't know personally. I don't know that we're ever going to see the same levels of chronic absenteeism as before the pandemic. At least for some years. I mean, you have to think about the fact that there were kids who were learning from in front of their computers for a number of years. I mean, that, especially for kids who were just coming into school, I mean, we may see the effects of that throughout their whole educational career. And that's something that we really need to grapple with. And we really, really need to start figuring out how to make kids understand that they're wanted and they're needed. It's not just about educational bottom lines, although that certainly is at play here. Schools, districts lose out on money when kids don't show up. But the real four-alarm fire is what's going to happen to those kids.
And there's been talk politically, it may be dead on arrival in most conversations, but talk about California shifting the funding model from attendance-based to enrollment-based, or some hybrid thereof. Even if that were to happen, that still doesn't address the services required to really keep those connections with families. And I would posit, too, that it's not just hiring additional staff. It's really a paradigm shift in the way that we as educators think about our families as partners and engage with them. And are we putting up walls? Are we hiding behind a bunch of acronyms? Are we hiding behind lingo or jargon, rather? Are we hiding behind languages, right? There's not enough translated into Spanish or whatever the language is. Are we hiding behind the fact that we're the ones with the quote-unquote knowledge and experience, and we are the quote professionals? And so we keep all of those different barriers, both seen and unseen, to keep the caste system in place? Or are we doing something different? And maybe financial realities are going to force entities to change. I'm seeing task forces pop up. We've got a working group on that. We've got community coordinator now at Einstein, and a portion of her job is to engage with families. We've got vans that we've got a van. We go pick kids up in the morning, sometimes just to drive them 2 blocks. Because it's really not the complication of I can't get to school because it's 2 blocks away, but I've already been absent for so long that the psychological barrier to get back in it. I mean, why do gyms make so much money? Because they enroll a bunch of people in January every year, and then by March they're not going. They can over-enroll the gym. People stop going, and then I'm not going in July. I'm ashamed to even see my trainer.
And that's what you just said, I think, is important. What's so strange about chronic absenteeism pre and post COVID is that so many kids are absent for the same reasons that they were before the pandemic. It's lack of transportation. At Horton, for example, there was a student who didn't come very often because she was scared about the walk from her home to school. It's that, again, that lack of connection. I mean, you can imagine, I'm sure, being a kid who misses a week or two. The last thing I would want to do is come back in and have no idea what the hell is going on in class. Yeah. That sounds incredibly unappetizing.
It does.
What have you seen at Albert Einstein? I mean, what has this, what I've called freely a crisis, looked like for your schools?
Yeah, prior to COVID, we built our budgets around 97.5% average daily attendance. Uh-huh. That had been based on 20 years almost of longitudinal experience, and there were years we hit 98.
Wow.
So that was a little bit of found money. And then when Omicron hit, we were struggling to break 90%. Wow. We were in like the 86, 87 for a while. And then even after we got to the point of kind of quasi all clear COVID, and the reason I say quasi is because the public health restrictions stayed in place. And even after they were lifted, they stayed in place mentally. So when kids had a little bit of a tickle in the throat or some sniffles, parents may or may not even communicate with school. They just kept the kid home.
Yeah.
So there was that. That was that hangover that endured. Mm-hmm. But we struggled last school year, the 22-23 academic year. Yeah, I mean, I think we lost probably $500,000 or so in funding. Mm-hmm. And, we're not a business. We need the money so that we can meet the needs of kids.
Yeah.
And having 30 kids in a classroom or 25 or 22, we still need to pay the teacher to teach those kids. Mm-hmm. Those costs don't go down, right? So it's been a fiscal impact. I think there's the psychological impact still remains to be measured. I don't know if it'll ever be accurately measured, but it's this, I see it as almost like the stretching of the ligaments, like you get injured in sports or something, and the ligaments get stretched out, and then are they ever going to go back to exactly how they were before? And that was dependent on what neighborhood folks were in, what kind of a background they come from. But for the first time ever, certainly in my lifetime, school started to feel like it was an optional thing. And there was very little consequence to someone not coming, at least from in the eyes of parents who are already working 2 and 3 jobs. And sometimes they're grandparents, right? So they're living with grandparents. There's all those different socioeconomic factors. We downgraded our target attendance rate, at least for budgeting purposes, because money doesn't come based on your dreams. I'd still like to be 98% or more. But I think from a fabric of the organization standpoint, it's been a challenge because of that very reason, where you have kids who just feel like they're drifting.
Yeah.
And whether that's a direct cause of rising anxiety among students, talk of self-harm and all those pieces, whether that's connected, that isolation, that those of us who are in positions of authority and power and jobs where we could come back and be in person now and kind of collectively block some of the COVID out of our minds. I don't think our kids are doing that still, right? They're still living with that unease that's just kind of persisting.
I mean, I think that they will for some time.
Yeah.
This isn't something that just goes away. This is something that you slowly learn to live with and you slowly grow out of. But the effect of COVID on everybody. I mean, kids in particular, because they are the most kind of at their most impressionable. They are growing. They are still formulating their view of the world and their understanding of the world and of themselves. But everybody, I mean, I know folks who are just not the same from where they were before the pandemic. And that is again, something that we're really going to have to grapple with. And I don't know necessarily that we've done a very good job of it.
it's interesting for me to reflect on the fact that we kind of touched on it a couple minutes ago, but historically teachers have been held in really positive,
Yeah.
been accorded a positive status in society. You know, when they ask, like, they do these surveys, like, where do politicians fall? Where do lawyers fall? Those two never really rank that high. But teachers have historically been in positions of, from the left and the right, seen as just, you know, it's a giving profession. It's a noble profession. Perhaps school administrators, maybe not so much. I don't know. I'd have to go back in and parse it. But for the first time in my memory, that kind of got thrown out. I mean, there were attacks on teachers as being, you know, as people going as far as to say that they were lazy for staying home.
Yeah.
Depending on whether you were in a red or blue pocket, depending on the culture wars and all those pieces. I think for the first time, families who had been historically kind of marginalized, whether it was because they were working all day or whatever the barriers were, they were tuning in along with their students to Zoom calls and seeing what was and was not happening in classrooms. Let's just face it, there was a wide range of what was happening in classrooms on Zoom, from really effective to really ineffective.
Yeah.
And I think we can all agree on that.
Yeah.
And so I think that had the effect of people going, wow, maybe, you know, it's ripping some of the cover off of the baseball a little bit and looking, pulling the twine and going, wow, there's more here. Like, what has been happening in education? And so I think that my observation is that, you know, the pandemic in general really bruised people.
Yes.
And I don't think we're back to pre-COVID in terms of healing that way. And, you know, we can look at the graduate schools of education, their enrollment's way down. You can look at the marketplace when you advertise for a teaching position. There are no applicants. That's not just in the charter world, that's everywhere. You see districts paying signing bonuses, go to a hiring fair, get a job that day. Like, that never happened before. Yeah. So there's this, I think it's hard to just look at one piece of it, but I've appreciated Voice of San Diego's reporting on that, and your work on the chronic absenteeism. Are there other stories in education that you've done? I know you've done a lot in a very short amount of time, so that's commendable. Other areas that excite you that you've written about?
Yeah, I mean, first, if I can go back to that, I think that teachers, educators are in a very, very strange time right now. They're kind of stuck in this vice between politics and curriculum, right? And I think folks had complaints about both of those things. Some may be fair, some may be not so fair. You know, we have seen a huge realignment in kind of the reading wars, phonics versus whole language kind of stuff, and that was, I know, something that was really that when parents saw what their kids were being taught over the pandemic, that's an example of a lot of folks saying, hey, you're not like actually teaching my kid to read right now. Right. you're showing him some pictures, right, and blah blah blah. And so that falls into the category of stuff that I think is pretty fair. That forced, I think, a reckoning with the realities of how we teach our kids, the arguably most fundamental and important skill of reading. And I think that maybe we're better off for that sort of realization, right? And it's unfortunate that teachers have, been fallen on the attacked side of that. But then there are other elements, like I've done some reporting on sort of the culture wars and the politics and kind of this cultural panic that's existed. You know, you see it every day at some school board meetings. You see it every day in some school libraries where there are folks, with signs yelling about whether it's COVID vaccination stuff or this book is too gay or whatever. And that may be, in my perspective, maybe fall on the less fair side. But regardless of what it is, teachers are in the middle of this, and they realized, I think, over the pandemic, that it is a very, very, very hard time to be a teacher. And we're in for trouble if that continues. We're in for trouble if that perception continues, because it's not really far from reality. We saw a wave of resignations and retirements, a wave of people saying, hey, teaching is just not for me anymore. I don't want to be on the front lines of these these various culture wars. And so that's difficult. I've written some stuff about that, but I've tried to stay away from some of it simply because I think that what voice really offers is a view into more systemic issues. And, I'm not saying that bigotry or culture wars are not a systemic issue. I think they are, and I think they're important to cover. But for me, the things that allow us a deeper view and a peek inside of schools is what attracts me more. So for me, I really have focused a lot on inequities in education. We spoke a bit earlier about how chronic absenteeism basically is very much a function of poverty, but it's not the only educational metric, as I'm sure you know. Essentially, everything in education is based on poverty. If you show me, a zip code's income level, I can pretty much tell you whether or not what those test scores are going to look like.
Yeah, I had a mentor who, tongue-in-cheek, said, it's interesting that all the brightest kids in California live within 1 mile of the Pacific Ocean.
It is interesting, yeah. Education has always been viewed sort of as the great equalizer, and I think that over the years we've seen that is a bit of a fantasy, unfortunately. I think that education is vital, and for some kids it can offer a step up into whether it is a level of intellect or a socio-demographic, level that their parents didn't have access to. But education is, at its core, very unequal. Poverty dictates almost everything. Poverty and demographics dictate almost everything. And that is a harsh reality that I feel like more people have been willing to face, but one that still, I think, people don't talk about enough. And so that's some of what I've tried to do, whether that's, in reporting that talks about chronic absenteeism and the way it affects some kids more, or whether it talks about, I did this one piece that just was basically a series of graphs, right? These kind of scatter plots that showed the relationship between test scores and free and reduced price meal percentages, test scores between demographics, and the one thing that you see is that all of these things are correlate very closely, right? I did another piece recently about inequities in suspension rates across schools and demographics, and I think that we can only really start to succeed with all kids when we really focus on the kids who are struggling the most. The kids who don't necessarily, their parents don't have funds to help them get an AP tutor, don't have funds to necessarily have a car to pick them up. They are working 2 jobs. I mean, these are the kids who most need help and who we most desperately need to help. It's
so interesting that, we strive to measure everything, right? And I've appreciated your stories. I've looked, I know Voice of San Diego, I don't know if it was you, but did like a regression analysis of trying to predict based on free and reduced percentages where schools should, I guess in quotations, fall in terms of achievement, and then you'd look at outliers on that, right? Above and below that line. And that's really important to think about. Then I also think about things like when you talk about suspension and expulsion, the things that never get measured, right? So the soft suspensions and expulsions, right? The times that an administrator counsels a parent to take their kid home for 2-3 days. They need to cool off. They need this. They need that. You know what? We're not going to go through with this, but they need to. And you can't tell me that doesn't happen all over, charter, non-charter.
Yeah, it does.
you can't tell me that a district circular or a charter school policy or protocol internally can entirely prevent that, right? And that's these squishy, soft human areas where if our mindset doesn't change, we'll continue to perpetrate that stuff.
Yeah.
Right? You get someone who doesn't speak English. You've got a student who has special needs, all these different pieces, and the parents are just struggling to do anything and everything they can. And an administrator in a suit says, you know what, how about let's just come back next week and we'll talk about this, right? Now junior's missed 2, 3, 4 days of school, doesn't show up anywhere as anything other than he just wasn't there or she wasn't there for 3, 4 days.
Yeah.
And we're just kicking this can down the road. So
and that's really tough, right? You can implement policies, but no policy means a damn if people aren't following it, and it's very, very, very difficult to get everybody on the same page. I mean, just to use San Diego Unified as an example, I mean, nearly 200 schools. I mean, 100,000 students, thousands of employees. I mean, how do you steer a ship that big? To me, it sounds impossible. You know, I do not envy Superintendent Lamont Jackson because that job sounds terrifying.
Yeah.
But again, trying to get everybody to walk in a line in that way, it sounds incredibly difficult.
A former superintendent, Bill Koba, who's been a few superintendents ago, I remember he told me, you know, our challenge is to try to get all employees of the district to see themselves as part of a team at their school site or wherever they are, and also at the district level.
Yeah.
And that's that didactic that's super challenging.
Yeah.
Right. Like it's the same, I think, that you feel in a corporation, like even someone in a Starbucks, right? So in a perfect world, yeah, they it's easier for them to feel connection to their customers who come every day and order the same thing, and they rely on that for tips and the whole thing. But then also to understand and embrace kind of the ethos of the entire corporation. Yeah, it's.
Well, I think the difficulty with that kind of stuff is at a school site, you're asking them to identify with people, right?
Yeah.
They know Miss Jenkins knows, you know, Mr. Howard, who teaches across the way. They know, like, little Jimmy, who's in their first period class. But when it comes to a district, they're being asked to identify with an entity.
An entity.
And that, I think, is incredibly difficult.
I'm listening to, this is just a rabbit hole, but that's kind of how my brain works sometimes, but I'm listening to Sapiens.
Okay.
And the author talks about the creation of myths. That Homo sapiens over time have created myths. One of the myths he talks about is the LLC, right? The limited liability corporation. It's a legal construct, but it's just an idea, right? It means you can do certain things, and that entity can be held liable for certain things, but not other things. And so I think about myths in terms of like an organization's mission and vision too, like. Even Voice of San Diego, Albert Einstein Academies, right? Like it takes a lot of work to have people believe in it and make it real in the real world and concrete, right? Otherwise, it's just like, okay, it's on this wall and going through my daily life, I'm not really thinking about it, you know, and that's really the challenge here. The tough thing in education is we're talking about humans, right? And lives that you know, are being changed, are going to change, whether we change them for positive or not so positive reasons.
Yeah. You're right. And so, I mean, ultimately, I think that's why it's so vital to get people walking in that line, and to get people who really care about walking in that line, right? And that's not to say that you should have an unthinking, you know, in group of followers teaching kids. But you need folks who really care.
Where do you see charter schools in this whole mix? Charter schools have now been around for 32 years. And I remember, because I'm one of the early, the OGs, to for lack of a better term, I remember when charter schools were really the Wild West, right? No credentials needed, no college degree needed to teach all these things.
Yeah.
And over time, regulations have come into place, the California Commission on Teacher Credentialing. And I know there are analogous situations around the country with charters to where now, 3 decades, it's not really this. It's part of the foundation of education.
Yeah.
Where do they fit in for you in the way you conceive of education when you're thinking about a story? Are you thinking like, in your case, San Diego Unified in general, or are you thinking, well, traditional district schools, could it look different in charters? Like, share some of your insight on that.
Yeah. So I went to both. I went to traditional public schools. I went to magnet schools. I went to San Diego Unified schools. I went to, as you mentioned earlier, I graduated from Helix over in La Mesa, which is a charter school. And I think that there has long been this tension, seems like a too gentle of a word, between the traditional public and charter schools. And I think San Diego Unified itself has demonstrated that, again, tension seems to be too kind of a word, that tension between what charter schools represent and within the educational context. And I think at their best, charter schools are sort of these laboratories of education. And I think that there is a great potential to that. But with any entity, it's important to ensure that there are some levels of standards. And the Wild West approach can offer some leeway when it comes to innovation. It can allow for some experimentation, but at the same time, regulation kind of stops these sort of gross oversteps that can occur in that kind of Wild West area. So I think that we're still trying to find that balance between public and charter schools. For many years, one of the defining characteristics of charter schools seemed to be that they were not unionized, right? In San Diego, we've seen kind of a wave of these unionizations, High Tech High most recently being a huge charter network. And I think my hope is that some of this allows us to put the contentious union aspect aside and just focus on what charter schools should be, which again are places that allow for the testing and the experimentation in education, and allow for the potential creation of new learning and teaching paradigms. And so I hope that for when I went to Helix, I enjoyed my experience. I don't know that I felt that there was much of a difference between the public schools that I went to before and that charter school. But I do hope, and especially for kids who've long attended schools that have been underperforming. Gompers comes to mind as a school that a lot of kids in Southeast have flocked to because they felt their local public schools are not good, frankly. And there are good things and bad things, right? The more kids from families who are connected and who even know what the hell a charter school is leave those public schools, there is that kind of brain drain. But at the same time, it's giving kids opportunities that they may not have had otherwise. And so I at this point I'm still fairly agnostic when it comes to charter schools, but I do hope that they offer the opportunity to create these new learning experiences that then maybe can seep into public schools.
So what kind of challenges have you faced in your career? It's a nascent career, but you've accomplished a lot in a short amount of time, and history was kind to you too, right? In terms of history wasn't kind to you. World events were not kind to your music career.
My music career wasn't kind to my music career.
But you've been able to report on really compelling topics in a really short amount of time, right?
Yeah.
What kind of challenges do you face as a young guy at the start of a career on the precipice of who the hell knows what in reporting, right?
Yeah.
In journalism, which seems like the last 20 years have just been a precipice, right?
Yeah.
And so how do you think about your work and make sure that you can do what you need to do? Because I'd imagine like there's times when doors get closed on you, or people don't want to take your call, or they think you're not experienced, or you weren't an educator first, or you didn't work for the AP. So what challenges have you faced, and how do you get past those?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, becoming a journalist and nowadays it feels a bit like stepping on a sinking ship, right? It looks pretty bleak out there. But ultimately, what I think guides me has been I worked shit jobs my whole life. I worked for minimum wage. I worked in jobs where people just didn't view me as a human. I always sort of struggled to make ends meet. And the one thing I was hoping, I was not expecting to struggle to make ends meet any less, but I was hoping to do so in a way that felt more impactful, right? And so I've carried that as I've come into journalism. You know, I've struggled, and I think that allows me to find stories that maybe others haven't thought about. And the challenges that I've faced really have really been, I think, adjusting the way I think and adjusting myself to this new world of journalism. I mean, it is very much a sort of calling, and it is not so much a career, although clearly it is. But it requires a dedication and requires a degree of kind of being on 24/7 that is difficult to overstate, and so adjusting to that has been tough. I think that while early on when I went back to college, when I went back to community college, city college, I was I really struggled with sort of imposter syndrome and feeling like, man, I'm going to be the weird old dude in all these classes, right? And it was funny because coming out of music, imposter syndrome was always something I struggled with as well. It's that thing like, you go somewhere new, but you're still you kind of thing. And the one thing that I've felt has helped is just to work as hard as you can. I mean, if you are working as hard as you can, people just have to take you seriously. And so there certainly has been some adjustment to that, and some insecurity and some self-consciousness. But my perspective has just been, if I keep grinding, if I beat the wheels off of all this, if I make sure that I am the one that's working harder than anyone else in this room, working harder on this beat than any other journalist in San Diego, and that's not to say that I am. The other education journalists in San Diego are quite great. Then not only will they take me seriously, but more importantly, I'll take myself seriously. And so that's I think been the biggest. Well, you know what? I also have another just pragmatic challenge, which is I'm still in school. I'm about semester and a half away from finishing my bachelor's degree.
Wow.
Congratulations.
Thank
you. It's only taken 15 years. And so that's been quite difficult. Basically working two jobs, school and work. And that just on like just a very real level, God, I cannot wait to be done with school.
Right. Yeah, they say if you need something done, give it to a busy person.
There you go.
Right?
Yeah.
People learn to prioritize and manage their time, but sometimes, we wish we had a time manufacturing machine. And
oh, for sure.
Trust me, I've been around long enough to tell you it ain't going to happen.
And that's one thing that's been interesting too. I've always been busy. Working two jobs at a time, playing in multiple bands, blah 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 blah. But this has always felt like a different kind of busy. one if you're late to your job, working at the music venue, it's like, okay, oh well. If you're late to cover an event or meet a source or whatever it is, that feels a lot worse. That's just not good. And so feeling more a degree of responsibility that is different than I used to feel has been a big adjustment.
Is AI going to change your job?
Shit, I hope not.
Do you use it? I use it every day.
Yeah.
So I use ChatGPT and other tools. I'm playing around with some tools to translate my staff videos into other languages. I speak Spanish, but it's faster to have AI dub that in, and actually does a fairly good job of having my voice. But I'm looking at one in German and things.
Wow.
So I was just wondering because I know there was this article. There was an article in the Atlantic, I think, where the reporter had, I think he wrote an article and then had AI write the same article, and that was already 6 months ago. So it's gotten a lot better, the language learning models.
I've experimented a little bit with AI, but it's mostly just like, hey, write a Blink-182 song about San Diego. It's just like the silly stuff. But I'm not sure. AI is one of those things that seems impossible to predict. Every 6 months, there's some just shocking leap forward in the way that these technologies work. I don't use it personally in work, but I do know there are folks who do, and I think one of the things that AI will never be able to manage, and I'll probably be proven wrong in like about a week, but is the human aspect of reporting, right? Reporting is not finding some stats and writing a description of those. I mean, sometimes that's part of it, but reporting is about speaking to people and relating to them.
Hopefully in person, right?
Hopefully in person, and empathizing with them, and then funneling that into something larger and trying to tell stories about people and about the world. And I don't necessarily know that AI will ever be able to convincingly have humanity.
Feel emotion.
Yeah.
Feel fear, feel love. Yeah.
Because journalism is a sensitive job, and I know that there's some folks who maybe use AI to write a headline or to write a subhead or to write a tweet about your story, right? That kind of stuff makes sense. I feel like ChatGPT can probably do a pretty good job of summarizing things, but when it comes to weaving together human stories and coming up with a message and a narrative, I don't necessarily know that AI can do that, simply because all of the world that it's seen, it's experienced as a technology and not as a person.
Yeah, time will tell, right? We'll see.
And again, in a week and a half, I'll be proven wrong, but yeah.
So you have a newsletter called The Learning Curve.
I do,
which I've appreciated, and I encourage folks to sign up for it. Does that encapsulate all the articles you write, and they just get dropped in there, and that's so that folks can kind of follow you in their own separate feed, correct?
So it's not every article I write. It's a special newsletter that comes out. God, I hate that bi-weekly and bi-monthly mean the same thing and not the same thing. But it comes out every 2 weeks, every other Wednesday. And the goal with the newsletter is to be able to write in a more conversational style, to be able to write about things that maybe aren't a full story, but are still interesting and still allow you to have a peek into the world of education journalism in San Diego. And so if I find like a little interesting tidbit, that's generally where it goes. And so It's, I can't take credit for the name. It's been around for a couple education journalists before me, but it's been a really interesting and unique challenge, and it keeps me on my toes. I know every 2 weeks I gotta have a newsletter out. And it's been fun it's been fun because it allows me to experiment with different ways of writing. I've written a couple that were super conversational. I wrote one about, one in particular comes to mind about the thing that scares me the most about education journalism, which is the possibility, however remote or not, that I may one day have to cover a school shooting. And as a kid who grew up in San Diego, I was going to La Mesa Middle, and within a couple weeks there were 2 shootings at schools not at all far from me in San Diego. And that possibility is one that genuinely is the most frightening thing I could ever imagine. And so being able to put more of myself, more of my own experiences and voice to, screen, but I'll say paper because it sounds better, it has been an interesting challenge and a very cool opportunity.
How can we as educators prepare students for a career like yours?
It's a good question. I think that journalists aren't people who know how to write an AP style. ChatGPT can do that.
Right.
Journalists aren't people who need to know a specific set of terminology.
ChatGPT can do that.
ChatGPT can do that. Journalists are people who are critical thinkers, and people who in my opinion, I think often the best journalists are people who didn't expect to be journalists, but people who are inspired by stories, people who in whatever way they can want to make the world a better place. And so I think that the best thing educators can do is to do their utmost to help kids grow into fully rounded human beings who have critical thinking, who have empathy, who have curiosity above all else, probably. I think that is the key, right? Encouraging and instilling a degree of a willingness to explore new things, and a willingness to talk to people, and a degree of care about this world, because we talked a little bit about this earlier, but we're living in a time that's really frightening. We are so polarized. The distance between people is so extreme, and so I think part of what journalists need to do is to help people understand why they should care about the world around them and the people in it. And so allowing for kids to develop those kinds of base skills of critical thinking and curiosity and empathy are really the key foundations of what makes a good journalist, or a writer even, any kind of person who creates.
You've been very generous with your time and appreciate it. I know you, as you say, you work 2 full-time jobs. One you get paid for, the other one you don't get paid for.
One I pay for, the other one one I get paid by, the other one I pay for.
There you go. There you go. I have one last question, but before I get there, is there anything you'd like to add to today's conversation that we haven't touched on that's maybe rattling around in your journalist head?
Well, there is one thing I wanted to ask you.
Yes.
Which is...
That always makes me nervous because I have a couple times. Actually, the last time that happened, a journalist asked me. So
yeah, well,
I'll see what I can do.
That's a compulsion.
I control the editing here. So,
but I'm curious, as somebody who's been an educator for
30 years.
30 years. Yeah. Coming out of COVID, coming out of what is unquestionably the biggest shakeup in education in the past, I would say 50 years at least. What do you think is the most important thing for education journalists to be focusing on?
I think you touched on it when you talked about the inequities.
Mm-hmm.
COVID brought that to the forefront.
Mm-hmm.
But we're going to quickly have that fade away, have COVID fade away in our consciousness because we're so busy and we're all looking forward.
Mm-hmm.
And to not lose sight of the inequities that exist, and asking the hard questions about things like, why is the chronic absenteeism 75% in one school in a region, and 10 miles away it's at 5%?
Yeah.
I think we also need to continue to ask the hard questions around things like budget decisions.
Mm-hmm. Especially now as
we got a cliff out there, dude,
yeah,
and
we're leaving the COVID funding era.
We're sliding towards it.
Yeah.
And to watch what happens with that and try to ask the proactive questions ahead of time. It's tough. You're getting into organized labor.
Mm-hmm.
People don't want to poke that bear sometimes.
Yeah.
But so what's going to happen? So you're seeing 20% year-over-year increases sometimes in districts like LA Unified and others. And I'm not saying that educators don't deserve to be paid for their work. It's important work. But it'd be great if these entities stayed around for another 20, 50, 100 years, right?
Yeah.
Instead of having to get bailed out by some other government entity.
Mm-hmm.
And we know in the charter world that's a lot more acute because we don't have some of those abilities to have someone back us up if we can't manage our own money.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's going to be a lot of questions to ask around why was spending the way it was 2 years ago when everybody knew monies were one-time monies.
Mm-hmm.
And all these folks were hired. And now you're going to see a bunch of pink slips. You're going to see that rolling through. And to ask those questions, it's the question nobody wants to ask. It doesn't make me really popular, but is that model still the best model, right? Mm-hmm. Last in, first out, seniority that way. I mean, this is probably why I don't get invited to a lot of happy hours, but I mean, is this the right way to go about it? Is it the right way to go about it that the school that you mentioned that has 75% chronic absenteeism very often will be the least quote unquote desirable school for teachers in a district to work at? Mm-hmm. How does that go together? Like if you want to talk about equity and connection, and this isn't a criticism of school districts or, charter. We haven't figured it out in the charter world either, right? We don't oftentimes have union structures or constraints, but we're not doing an appreciably better job with managing our budgets. We're not doing an appreciably better job with connecting to our least connected folks. Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of homelessness questions to be asked by education reporters. The McKinney-Vento Act defines homelessness much more broadly than the average person carries around in their head as they drive by someone in a tent on the sidewalk.
Which rightfully so. I mean,
totally rightfully so, right? Like you and me should try to function in our daily lives if we're on a different couch every night, right? In a different house or whatever, a trailer, whatever it is. So I think there's massive questions to be asked in that area.
Especially in a place like San Diego.
Especially in a place like San Diego with the challenges that we have with homeless populations and how, so now there's a camping ban. So now it's just you're seeing shifting migrations now. Go to the South Bay, go to Chula Vista, look on the off-ramps of the freeway, because what we're seeing, I mean, I think there's that, and then another area where it's so fruitful and controversial is questions around restorative practices versus punitive practices with students. And that's also part of the culture war, right? Where you're seeing a backlash now where certain districts are like, no, we don't do anything restorative. We're going back to strict discipline.
Yeah.
The irony for me, and this also doesn't make me popular sometimes, but the irony for me is as adults, like in our workplace, there's not a single adult I've ever met who's like, I want like a zero tolerance workplace where if I arrive 5 minutes late, I get punished. Or if I have to take an extra sick day that I don't have, that I lose pay. That doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't exist in my mind. But then when we get with kids, it's like they need to learn the discipline. They need this, they need that, there needs some strict consequences. I'm like, but you just wanted to take extra sick leave, and you came in and had this very cogent argument about how you should have extra time because as humans and et cetera. But with a 12-year-old whose prefrontal cortex is like 12 years away from being fully formed, and they're dealing with all these challenges, you know? So I think that also gets back to the equity and the inequity conversation. But your job is, one reason I wanted to talk to you selfishly is because your job seems so exciting. You know, you get to ask those tough questions, and then you don't need to work in those places where you ask the questions. You know?
Yeah.
So even this, you know, you were talking about demographics, and when you said the word demographics, it flashed in my head because we recently had a professional development day, and it was very fruitful and it was good. It was also kind of like an emotional rotor-rooter. It stirred up a bunch of stuff, and it's okay, man. We got to talk about these things. But I recall the word demographics being thrown out a bunch of times. And so that can be something that we use because we go, yeah, we need to understand our student population. Okay, that's a fairly neutral interpretation of that. But then you can say, ever since the demographics changed, we have this challenge or that challenge. Then you start to slide into ever since those kids or those people or those families started to come. And look, Einstein's not unique in that. That's all over the place, right? Demographic, the communities have shifted in San Diego, and we still have a really segregated city in a lot of ways, right? Concentrations of these challenges in certain neighborhoods. And so, man, you'll have articles to write for the rest of your time here in San Diego if you're courageous enough to bang on those doors and ask the questions.
Yeah, that's, you know, all of those are fascinating. I think for me, the homelessness question is one that I've been fascinated with. You know, it when we talk about the folks who have the least, I mean, homeless folks are those folks, you know, and it's difficult to look at this city and look at the way people are struggling and not see it refracted everywhere else, not see it reflected in the way our schools are functioning, not see it reflected in the way our workplaces or government is functioning. And so it is, you are right, it's a fascinating job that allows us to ask and every now and then get a little bit closer to an answer to some of these very, very hard questions. And I appreciate you. I appreciate the invite, David. Yeah. I appreciate, you know, this time. It's been lovely to talk to you.
Yeah, it's great. I feel like we could talk for hours.
Yeah, I think we could.
I want to wrap with this question.
Yeah.
So you're given the opportunity to design a billboard for the 5 freeway that encapsulates your own view, your vision of the world, what you think needs to still be done in the world, what's hopeful, what's dangerous, what's scary, whatever you want that billboard to say. It's not a Voice of San Diego billboard. It's your own, and people are driving by at 60, 70 miles an hour. What does your billboard say to the world about what's most meaningful to you?
That's an interesting question. You know, I don't know that I have an answer right off the bat, but
and it's okay if you don't. I've had people not have one. I've had people.
I'm curious, what does your billboard say? You must have thought about this.
I've thought about it a lot, and my billboard kind of changes based on what I'm experiencing at the time. So that's another thing.
Okay,
right?
So today, what's David's billboard look like?
I think mine would say something about. It would have some message about balance, about staying balanced. And I don't mean so much like work-life balance, but more balanced in terms of our reactions to things, our viewpoints. I think I'm feeling recently that the extremes of any spectrum scare me. Whether it's in the political sense, extreme far right or extreme far left. I don't think most of the work gets done on those two extremes. So it might be something like stay balanced, stay in the middle, because that's where the work gets done.
I think mine may just say help. And you can take that a couple different ways, right? Help each other, but also like help me,
like
please.
help. Like could be any, even if you put an exclamation point after it, that also has several different meanings, right?
Yeah.
Well,
I think because I think this world we're living in is one that needs some help.
I think that's a great place to end today's conversation, and thank you again for all the work you do, for the reporting. I really look forward to reading your newsletter and the articles in Voice of San Diego.
I appreciate that.
And it's a tough job that you have, so thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time, David. Next time we talk, we should do it with a beer in hand.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you for listening to the Superintendent's Hangout. You can follow me on Twitter at DVS1970. Please be sure to share this show with friends and family on social media and in the real world. Thank you to Brad Bacayao for editing and production assistance, and to Tina Royster for scheduling and logistics. Thanks for hanging out, and have a great day.